Hi everybody, this is Racontra1 Jack letting you know about my Dodge Coronet 500 hardtop of 1968 model. I traded the 1964 Dart GT convertible in on this 68 Coronet. 68 Coronet was dark green and the upholstery inside was dark green also. The first problem that surfaced with the car was the radio. And that seems to be a pattern Chrysler products in my experience in that time span. This radio was AM FM radio and it had vertical tuning knobs, which is rather strange. They were knurled knobs and they became disconnected, so you couldn't change the station. So I went through the usual experience of my first two Dodges, take it to the radio repair place, and they took the radio out and fixed it. After that, it was no problem. Also in this car, I had a reverb unit attached. Now this delayed the speech and music to the back speaker that was on the parcel shelf, and introduced a little delay, so it kind of gave you the impression of stereo, some depth to it, but it wasn't stereo, but it was a move in that general direction. So that was kind of cool. And on this car we had power steering and power brakes. It was at the dealer's lot, so there was no waiting for it. And I was dealing with the same Dodge dealer I had dealt with before. The car ran very well. It had 318 two-barrel with torque flight automatic. It had bucket seats, and there was the weak point. The stitching again weakened the vinyl fabric, so again they had to be reupholstered. Dodge did take care of that. I think they finally recognized that they needed to just simply emboss the pattern into the vinyl rather than make stitching, because the stitching would weaken the vinyl. So at any rate, that got fixed, and the car ran very well. But then, after a few rainstorms, I noticed a problem. I was getting rain in the car. It was starting as a pooling of water in front of the back seat. There would be so much water that it would move towards the front and winds up there in the driver's position in the floor. So try to figure out where is that coming from. So I took it back to a new Dodge dealer. I had moved in the meantime, and they said, oh yes, we'll take care of that. And I'm sure that they did absolutely nothing, because it was exactly the same when I got it back as initially. So it was up to me to figure out where it was coming from. In those days, there was kind of a rain gutter that was above the windows. The purpose of the rain gutter was to channel the rainwater away from the door when you opened the door, so you wouldn't get doused by a bunch of water that was laying there. A good idea in theory, but it turns out that this rain gutter, after playing the hose on this general area, what it was doing is instead of directing it towards the outside of the car, the bottommost portion of it was right above the channel for the side rear window. So what was happening was the rain was being diverted right into the car, right into the window channel, and that's where it was coming in. So the way I dealt with that was to get something called dum-dum popularly. It's like a gray putty, and it's like in a roll. And so I fashioned a little extension to those rain gutters on either side, and it moved the water further south and didn't allow it to get into the car. So I solved the problem, and pretty inexpensively at that. So that was problem number 2. The car ran well. The torque flight was very smooth shifting. But the overall guarantee for the car was 5 years, 50,000 miles for the powertrain. Now, as I remember, maintenance for the transmission, they were extending the maintenance periods. Back then, they had sealed ball joints that supposedly didn't require relubrication. They were experimenting with extending the intervals for lubrication. So it seems to me that the transmission didn't require replacement of fluid till maybe about 50,000. Well, at about, I'd say around 48,000, I began hearing noises. I thought they might be transmission noises. I took it back to the Dodge dealer, a new one this time, and replaced the fluid. And I said, what do you think about the noise? So bring it back when it gets louder. Well, I should have known that was a stall tactic, and a little over 50,000 miles I had a transmission failure. Now the way it failed was I lost reverse gear. So what would happen is I come to a stop, and if I had put it in reverse, you would really have to gun it to move at all. It would just creep backwards. So essentially reverse was shot. And so I didn't go back to the Dodge dealer. I figured it would be, although I could have pressed the point, I suppose, and say I brought it in with the defect and you did nothing, and it was before the warranty expired. But at any rate, I got an independent person to rebuild the transmission. That's what it required. And after that, it didn't give me any more trouble. In the meantime, I had aftermarket air conditioning put in the car. That worked well. And the issue that I had as an ongoing problem with this car was the starter motor. I had to replace it a couple times, and the only thing I can think of is that the seal there around it failed, and somehow water got into it, and so the solenoid failed on it essentially. Solenoid wasn't separate; it was part of the alternate of the starter. So that was a mess redoing that. And that 63 and 64 didn't have that problem, but I sure had it in the 68. The last problem that I had with the car was a structural one, and that was right where the end of the front door hits the back section of the rear quarter, right at that juncture, where the B-pillar would be if this was a two-door sedan. Well, right as that rear quarter makes that turn and turns outward and becomes part of the rear quarter sheet metal, a fracture developed, and a couple of repairs were attempted, and at least one of them required welding. They welded shut and repaint, and sure enough, it would open up again. I haven't heard of anyone else having that problem, so this may have been peculiar to this car. This may have missed a couple body welds coming down the line and developed this weak point. So that was the that was the other failure of the car. And I also developed some rust, serious rust, on the rear quarter, down around the bottom of edge of the rear quarter behind the rear wheels. And also, this back window of this car is kind of a strange compound curve. And there is there's stainless that wraps that window, and underneath that is where rust would form, and over a period of time that became rusty. So the car, after 4 years, was no more than that. I had it through 1975. So I had it 7 years, and it gave good service. But I say it did have some peculiarities, and the engine never had to touch that. That was all the way through the end. It worked fine. So that's my story about the Dodge Coronet 500. But soon I was to change what kind of car I bought. So I will let that kind of be a little mystery and return at some point with the next car on the schedule. So thanks again for all your loyal viewing and for your comments. I sure appreciate my audience. Thanks a lot.